War, Security, and Racism, Lessons from World War II. This PowerPoint will walk us through the events of World War II in Canada for the most part. This presentation goes with the War and Racism activity sheet, so make sure you have the activity sheet handy as we go through the presentation so that you can fill in the blanks and answer the questions. If you fill in the blanks and answer the questions as we go, you should do quite well on the quiz. So first of all, my references. So I want to acknowledge the work of the students in my two 2006 Hope and Hardship classes. We had smaller classes then, and instead of a lecture for that class, students gave presentations, and it is their presentation slides and their research with a little bit of extra research from me and some organization and some editing that I've used to put together this presentation. So I want to give them credit for their work. Onwards. So World War II began in 1939 for Canada, and it continued until 1945. Canada joined World War II in 1939 when Germany invaded Poland. Canada was one of the Allies. We joined the United Kingdom, France, Australia, and New Zealand. And in 1941, China, the USSR, the United Soviet Socialist Republic, and the United States of America also joined the Allies. We were all fighting against the Axis. So this included Germany, Japan, Italy, and then Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Slovakia, etc. Canada's domestic policies during the war were strongly influenced by the policies in the United Kingdom and in the United States. And in both countries, the policies were very paranoid. They were xenophobic. Check out the concepts for a definition of xenophobia. And they were very strict. Canada deployed the Defence of Canada Regulations. This was a section of the War Measures Act that allowed the Canadian government to clamp down on people's civil rights and to limit dissent within the country. So on June 4th in 1940, communist, anarchist, and fascist organizations were outlawed, and some members of those groups were interned. Interned means to jail. Their offices and meeting halls were closed, their printing presses and other assets were seized. It's kind of like if we sort of took down their websites today, and their publications were banned. Under the Defence of Canada regulations, all enemy aliens, so this was the word to talk about people who were German, Italian, or Japanese who were suddenly suspect, right? They had to register and report regularly to the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Members of these groups could not travel more than 12 miles from their residence or change their address without permission. The government interned members of the Italian and German communities that the RCMP found to be security risks. And the government interned almost all of the Japanese-descended people in Canada, certainly in BC, often without evidence of criminal or disloyal behavior of any sort. It wasn't until after the war that Canada admitted any substantial number of refugees. There was very little compassion for those fleeing the war. Immigrants and refugees during World War II were often suspected of being covert Nazi agents and were considered serious security risks until the Allied victory in 1945. It's important to understand the sort of climate in Canada at the beginning of World War II and through much of World War II, frankly. Just as we have a very interesting climate in our world today, during World War II, between 1939 and 1945, there was quite the mood in Canada. So reports were coming from the Netherlands and from France of a German fifth column. So this is basically saboteurs. This is people in the country that help the enemy to further invade. So people in the Netherlands who were working for Germany, or people in France who were working for Germany. The Nazis were storming across Europe, and many here believed that only because they had spies in those countries could Hitler possibly have been so victorious. Despite the fact that Canada was never really attacked during World War II, media reports in Canada were designed to drum up patriotism, and they made invasion seem like it was a real possibility. This paranoia led to totally unnecessary security measures like air raid blackouts in Toronto and Saskatchewan. Those of you who don't know what air raid blackouts are, first of all, count yourself lucky. But second of all, so before you had GPS or very good radar, when planes flew over countries to drop bombs, what they relied on was lights. Right, so they would fly over the Blitzkrieg. The German bombers would fly over England at night, and they would look for the lights of big cities, and where they saw those lights, they would drop their bombs. So an air raid blackout is when, after dark, every light in a city has to be out. So the street lights were turned out. Businesses weren't allowed to have lit signs. If you had lights on in your house, you had to cover your windows with big, thick blankets or cardboard, something that the light could not get through. And so this meant that not only, it meant that the whole world was different, right? Just like nowadays, we have to wear a mask, we can't hang out closely with the people we care about often. So back then, in the evenings, people had to either keep their lights off or cover out all of their windows with heavy window coverings. So this was completely unnecessary. If you look at a map of Canada, take a look at where Toronto is, take a look at where Saskatchewan is. They're pretty much both in the middle of the country. And even today, flights often have to stop in Newfoundland to get more fuel before they can get to central Canada. So there was no way that Nazi bombers or Japanese planes were going to be able to make it across the ocean and then into the middle of Canada. Also, Canada's not that important, and Toronto and Saskatchewan back then especially were not strategic targets. It would not have been a good use of the German military or the Japanese military's time. Organizations like the Canadian Legion, so that's groups of veterans from World War I, threatened to form protective units that would take the law into their own hands. So they're basically talking about vigilantism by acting against all aliens. And what they mean by that is basically immigrants in Canada, including naturalized citizens. So a naturalized citizens, we would talk about permanent resident today. So these were people who had become Canadian citizens, full Canadian citizens. In some cities, vigilante civilian protection committees were being formed. And it wasn't just regular people who were being foolish, it was the leadership of Canada, a bit like certain things today. So in 1941, C.J. Mackenzie, who was the president of the National Research Council, he told university officials that they were not to employ enemy aliens. So we're talking anybody from Italy, anybody from Germany, anybody with Japanese relations in any work that had contact with secret information, even if those people were brilliant. The officials in Toronto, as well as the Premier of Ontario and the Attorney General of Ontario, advised people to tell on any work colleagues that they suspected were disloyal or basically were spies. In May of 1940, 12,000 people rallied in Vancouver to demand that the government enlist veterans, so this goes back to the Legion idea, to help police eradicate espionage and sabotage, and that enemy aliens be barred from government and employment in key industries. Right? So people are scared and they're looking for scapegoats. They're looking for targets for their fear. In August 1940, the National Resources Mobilization Act required all citizens over 16 to register for the government. This was partly to prepare for conscription. Conscription is when the government tells people that they are going to become soldiers and they don't have any choice. They have to go fight. Okay. So I wanted to show you an example of the kind of thing that was creating fear in Canada. So this is a piece of anti-Japanese propaganda. It ran in newspapers. It was put on bus shelters, etc. So you can, if we were in class, I would ask you, what do you see here? Right? So what you see is a monstrous caricature of a Japanese person. So you can tell they're Japanese because they have a Japanese flag on their hat, and you can see they're lit from below, which is, have you ever seen that sort of campfire trick where you hold a flashlight under your chin and your face looks kind of scary in the dark? It's good for frightening very small kids. And that's how this Japanese person is being portrayed. Look at their hand, right? They're being portrayed as having claws, and they're holding a big knife. And who are they attacking? This is also relevant, right? So they are attacking a white woman. I hopefully don't need to tell you that this is a racist depiction of Japanese people. They're playing on people's emotions, fear, protectiveness, and also it's a time when there was still an awful lot of anti-Asian racism, which we'll talk more about later. So this propaganda sort of plugs into that also. So this kind of image was common. So there were three groups of quote-unquote enemy aliens: German Canadians, Italian Canadians, and Japanese Canadians. So I'm going to talk about each group briefly here. So German Canadians had already been through the ringer in World War I, because Canada was on the opposite side from Germany in World War I as well. During World War I, public anti-German feelings ran high in Canada. Members of the German community were charged with treason. German clubs and schools were closed. So there had already been a period of intense discrimination against German Canadians. So in 1939, the Canadian government arrested and interned 200 Nazi sympathizers. Now, of all of the people I'm going to tell you about, these are the only folks that I am certain there could have been good reason to put in jail. Okay, so these were folks who thought that Hitler was a cool dude and that Nazism was awesome. The Canadian government arrested and interned another 637 German Canadians for a total of 837 German Canadian farmers, workers, and club members who had been denounced by their neighbors or deemed disloyal. During the war, there were reports of some employees of German background being fired without cause in Toronto, just because they were German. Canada denied sanctuary to most of the German refugees from the Reich. It was the Third Reich, the Nazis, with the exception of 972 refugees who were shipped from camps in Britain, where it was feared they might try to help the invading German forces. So they were shipped to Canada, and Canada put them in internment camps in 1940. Only one other German refugee group was admitted during the war, and they were admitted because of British pressure. This was 1,043 Sudeten German Social Democrats, and they were settled as far from any kind of city or important strategic location as possible in the Tupper Creek Wilderness in northeastern Saskatchewan. So again, look at a map, Saskatchewan, and especially northeastern Saskatchewan, pretty remote spots. Italian Canadians. In early 1940, the federal government abolished Nazi and communist organizations, and they arrested communists and fascists who were sympathetic to Italy's fascist government. Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King announced that he had invoked the Defense of Canada regulations and ordered the internment of hundreds of Italian Canadians identified by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police as enemy aliens. The federal government passed an order in council which called for the registration of all persons of Italian birth who had become British subjects, basically Canadians, after September 1st, 1922. And the custodian of enemy alien property was authorized to confiscate the properties of detained enemy aliens. The roundup of Italian Canadians was pretty much finished by October 1940. Most of the nearly 700 Italian Canadians who were jailed were sent to Camp Petawawa in the Ottawa River Valley. Many Italian Canadians who were not interned were required to report to the RCMP monthly. Throughout Canada, a spontaneous boycott, so that's refusing to use Italian businesses, took place, and provincial governments ordered municipality to stop relief payments to non-naturalized Italians. So what that means is welfare to people who basically weren't full citizens, okay? Travel restrictions were imposed on Italian Canadians, and activities such as teaching the Italian language and meetings of Italian societies and clubs were declared illegal. Most Italians in Canada put on a brave face and continued their daily lives with patience and strength of character. Times were extremely difficult for the families of the internees, of the men who had been jailed. Hundreds of Italian-descended men volunteered to enlist in the Canadian Armed Forces, some in a desperate attempt to remove the stigma associated with the label enemy alien, while others joined because they believed that the war against fascism and Nazism was justified. Until the late 1980s, when the National Congress of Italian Canadians spearheaded an effort to have the Government of Canada address the issue, very little was known about the internment of Italians during World War II. It was kind of considered shameful and not talked about. Various position papers were submitted to Prime Minister Brian Mulroney by Italian Canadian organizations addressing the need for both an apology and reparations. As a result of these efforts, on November 4 in 1990, during the National Congress of Italian Canadians biannual conference in Toronto, Prime Minister Brian Mulroney apologized to the Italian community for the internment. So the last group is the Japanese, right? We've already talked, when we talked about the Komagata-maru, when we talked about Chinese workers, and we talked a little bit about Japanese immigrants at that time, about the anti-Asian attitudes in Canada, and in particular in British Columbia. So although people from Japan had been settling in Canada since 1877, they were still profoundly segregated, and they were still considered foreigners by most British-descended Canadians. Although 75% of the Japanese Canadian population here were Canadian citizens, and 60% of them had been born here, of the 22,000 and a handful Japanese Canadians who lived in British Columbia, only 142 men who had fought in World War I were legally permitted to vote. If you didn't have a vote, you couldn't enter the professions. So Native people who entered the professions, they had to give up their status in order to get a vote. But Japanese folks who didn't have a vote couldn't enter professions. So most of them were resource workers, fishers, farmers, or entrepreneurs. Japanese folks had more economic success than the Chinese community due to there being fewer restrictions against them. If you read the Avery reading on Asian immigrant workers in BC, you read about the fact that Japanese immigrants did not have to pay a head tax while the Chinese did. But the economic success of the Japanese led to resentment from non-Asian British Columbia citizens. Racism is crappy that way. If you're poor, they say you're poor because your race makes you lesser. If you're well off, it creates resentment. So, for example, Japanese fishers were experienced, because fishing is a traditional occupation in Japan, they were efficient and they were hardworking. Over time, many of these fishers came to own boats and provided jobs for other Japanese Canadians. Non-Asian fishers resented Japanese achievement and pushed the government successfully to have the number of fishing licenses granted to Japanese fishers reduced. Because Japanese people did not have a vote, politicians found that they could easily win votes in British Columbia by supporting anti-Asian laws and anti-Asian regulations. You'll remember that Chinese folks didn't have a vote in Canada up until 1947 either, okay? So during World War II, Ian Mackenzie was the Member of Parliament for Vancouver Centre. He was the only MP in the federal government who was from British Columbia. And because of this, Prime Minister King gave him a place in the cabinet, that's the circle of people who are sort of the closest advisors to the Prime Minister, as the Minister of Pensions and Health. Mackenzie was openly racist, and he used this slogan: "Let our slogan for British Columbia be, no Japs from the Rockies to the sea." So that was from his nomination speech in 1944, so towards the end of the war. Please don't use the word Japs. It's very racist. And yeah, if you get punched in the nose because you used it, don't complain to me. Enemy alien cards. In the spring of 1947, please note, spring of 1947, this was more than 6 months before the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the RCMP fingerprinted and photographed all Japanese Canadians over the age of 16. Japanese Canadians were required to carry their registration card at all times until 1949. I have a little story to tell about that. So I have a friend who is Japanese Canadian, and a few years ago, her father in British Columbia passed away. She went out to BC to help her mother around, the funeral arrangements, and then ended up helping her mom sort of clean out some of her father's stuff. And she actually called me from British Columbia to tell me that in sort of cleaning out her father's wallet, she found his registration card. So his enemy alien card from during World War II. And she sort of showed it to her mom and asked her mom, she was like, why on earth is dad still carrying this? So this was in the early 2000s. And her mom said that he carried it his entire life. So he carried it from the war on because the war left him afraid that if he was ever sort of apprehended by the police or pulled over, etc., and he didn't have it, he would be in trouble, right? So just to sort of show the impact that this kind of stuff has on people. So in addition to being registered and monitored by the RCMP, Japanese Canadians, unlike the German and Italian folks, were required to observe a dusk to dawn curfew. So it was illegal for them to be out of their homes at night. It was decided that an air raid blackout would be enforced in Vancouver every night for days after the 1941 December attack on Pearl Harbor and Hong Kong. This led people to imagine that British Columbia was in imminent danger of attack. So again, the air raid blackout doesn't really accomplish very much except to frighten the populace. So again, it was really unlikely that British Columbia was going to be attacked. Not just because British Columbia was a fairly long distance away from Japan, but also because it had little strategic value to the Japanese. Okay. Given the violent anti-Asian racism in Canada and British Columbia especially, Ian Mackenzie's voice in the federal cabinet, and the fear of invasion among non-Asian British Columbia residents, in the end, the mass jailing, the imprisonment of almost all the Japanese Canadians in British Columbia met with very little protest from other people. While Italian and German Canadian communities saw a few hundred mostly male members of their communities arrested and jailed, 95% of Japanese Canadians were placed in prison camps. Largely because of anti-Asian racism and the RCMP's inability to infiltrate, i.e. plant spies, in Japanese Canadian communities. Right, so part of what's going on here is just the RCMP's racism, right? So in the RCMP, there were a few Italian descended men. In the RCMP, there were a few German descended men. So the RCMP could get spies and find spies and talk people into being informants on the Italian community and the German community. There were no Japanese RCMP officers, right? And the RCMP, because of segregation and the RCMP's racism, couldn't find informants for the Japanese community, and I'm not sure how hard they tried. Okay, so this is part of the justification for why all of the Japanese Canadians, we're talking grandmas and babies, etc., were put in prison camps. So this is an enemy alien card. As you can see, it has a photo of the person in question. It has a date when they were registered. If they were Canadian born, it would say they were Canadian born. If they had been born in Japan, it would say that also. If you were born in Japan, you were under more suspicion, right? So this is what the enemy alien cards looked like. On December 7th, 1941, the Japanese military attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, and they attacked British-held Hong Kong, and Canada declared war on Japan. All of the fishing vessels operated by Japanese Canadians were ordered by radio into the nearest port. On December 8th, the confiscation of all 1,200 fishing boats belonging to the Japanese fishers began. These boats were placed under the control of the Japanese Fishing Vessel Disposal Committee. Following the lead of the United States and Latin American countries, Prime Minister Mackenzie King approved an order in council under the War Measures Act on February 24, 1941, to authorize the mandatory removal of Japanese Canadians from anywhere within 100 miles of the BC Pacific coast. The same day, a notice was issued by the Minister of Justice, Louis Saint Laurent, ordering all persons of Japanese descent to leave the coast. It also prohibited Japanese-descended people from having ammunition, cameras, radios, or motor vehicles, and from leaving the protected area. So there are accounts of Japanese families in British Columbia sitting down to dinner in their homes, the RCMP coming to their home, basically bursting in and leaving with their cameras, their radios, and driving away in the family car. Right? So the RCMP had the authority to enter homes at will without a warrant. Personal belongings such as cameras and radios were confiscated, and vehicles were impounded. By March 4, 1942, the British Columbia Security Commission, with Ian Mackenzie at the helm, had begun the removal of Japanese Canadians. On March 9, all adult male Japanese immigrants were ordered to report to the RCMP to learn the date of their removal to road camps. And a week after that, the first of a steady stream of shocked and angry Japanese families from the fishing villages and pulp towns along the Pacific coast of British Columbia arrived at the livestock building in Hastings Park. So you guys know the CNE grounds in Toronto, right? The Canadian National Exhibition grounds down Dufferin and Lakeshore. So there's the horse barn. Hopefully you guys know what I'm talking about, in the CNE grounds. In Vancouver, they have PNE grounds, the Pacific National Exhibition, and the livestock building that they're talking about here is a lot like the horse barn in the CNE grounds in Toronto. So this is where these people were sort of supposed to live, where they were held until they were transported to the prison camps. So these animal barns at Hastings Park, they reeked of manure, they had maggots, they were dirty, and they were completely inadequate for housing people. Animal barns. Japanese foods couldn't be cooked in the terrible kitchen facilities. The toilets were open troughs, and there was very little privacy. You can find photos, some of them on the website that I will give you as a supplementary link, of Japanese Canadians sort of hanging sheets between the stalls to try and make some privacy for themselves. This experience was humiliating and traumatic for Japanese Canadians. Families were separated as they arrived. The men and older boys who were to be shipped out to work camps were not allowed to stay with their wives, their children, and elders. Japanese Canadians were put on trains in the spring and summer of 1942 and sent to camps in the interior of British Columbia. Men were separated from their families and moved to labor camps. If families wanted to stay together, they had to agree to work as a family on sugar beet farms, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. There were a few particularly young Japanese men who resisted. I sort of picture, a young Japanese man watching an RCMP officer kind of push around or bully his grandmother and getting angry and sort of trying to pick a fight. So these who resisted were sent to prisoner of war camps in Angler and Petawawa, Ontario. So they ended up at the prisoner of war camps with the Italians, the Germans, and some folks who the British had sent over as prisoners of war. All the property and belongings of the Japanese Canadians were entrusted to the custodian of enemy alien property as an alleged protective measure, and we'll talk more about that later too. So these two images. First is a sort of, this would have been photocopied, well, back then not photocopied, would have daguerreotyped, and this would have been many pieces of paper that were posted on fences, bus shelters, telephone poles, electrical poles, sort of everywhere they could be up and down the BC coast. So this is a notice to all Japanese persons and persons of Japanese racial origin, because they can't say Japanese Canadians, that these areas have been made prohibited to all persons of the Japanese race. So these are all coastal towns. These are all places along the coast. So any persons of the Japanese race found within any of the said prohibited areas without a written permit from the British Columbia Security Commission, so that's Ian McKenzie, or the RCMP, shall be liable to, basically they'll be thrown in jail. Not that every Japanese person isn't about to be thrown in jail. Okay, so that's the kind of public notices that were being posted up and down in the early parts of the removal. This picture is a picture of the Japanese impounded fishing vessels. All right, so this is all of the Japanese fishers' boats that have been confiscated by the government. So my dad is an old Navy guy, and he also was a community college teacher for a while, at the end of his career, and sometimes he likes to talk with me about what I do. I was working on this presentation when I was home at the farm one day, and my dad looked over my shoulder and he was like, "What's that?" And so I explained what the picture was, and he got super riled up. He said that not only was it obviously racist that these folks all had to give up their boats, but he says that the boats, if they were tied up this way for any length of time, he doesn't think they could have been, but if they were, that this sort of formation of boats would ruin the boats, that they were too close to each other, and that if there were any kind of rough waters, they would damage each other. Right, so I don't know for boats, but if my dad says that's what would happen, my dad's probably right. So in the camps. So during the spring and summer of 1942, special trains left Vancouver for the work camps. And these trains were full of able-bodied men, and then other trains left for the internment camps, and this was the rest of the Japanese Canadians. So I just want to point out that the Nazis loaded Jews into trains to take them to Auschwitz and to the other concentration camps. Okay, so there's some creepy parallels here. There were 8 camps that were set up in ghost towns in the interior of BC. So these were towns that had once been thriving mining towns, often during the gold rush, that were mostly abandoned by 1942. So Greenwood, Caslow, Sandon, New Denver, and Slocan City were some of the camps. The existing buildings in these towns were too few to house everyone, and they were also falling apart because they were ghost towns. So hundreds of families spent the summer and the early fall of 1942 in tents, waiting for shacks to be constructed for them. The shacks that were built, and most of them were built with Japanese labor, just to be clear, were shoddy and small. The internees were crowded in, often with more than one family sharing space. And when I say sharing space, I'm talking the space that would be like the size of a classroom kind of thing. The lack of insulation or adequate heating led to harsh and chilly winters. I don't know if any of you have ever spent a winter in the Canadian Rockies, but it is cold. All food had to be bought out of salaries of 25 cents an hour or with grossly inadequate food allowances supplied by the government to the unemployed. All right, so the men who were working on the road crews were making 25 cents an hour, and everyone else was being given food allowance. Welfare workers who were in the camps estimated that the food allowances need to be increased by 55% just to meet the basic dietary needs of people. The Japanese Canadians comported themselves incredibly well in these camps. When you read about this, when you hear the stories of what happened, when you look at the photographs, the thing that stands out to me every time is how much dignity and kindness and decency the Japanese prisoners showed in the face of really poor treatment. So they organized themselves in the camps. They worked together on various projects. So during the war in Canada, there was something called victory bonds. You purchased a victory bond, sort of like a savings bond, and the money that you purchased it with went to the government for the war effort. And the idea was that at the end of the war, when everything was okay again, you could get your money back, right? So the Japanese actually staged a successful victory bond drive. So they bought their community. They didn't have nearly enough money. They just had all of their stuff confiscated. They managed to raise money and buy these victory bonds. So this sort of effort and organization led to links with local white communities in the BC mountains, and it lessened the isolation of the folks in the camps. Doukhobors, who were a group of, it was a sect, a particular sect of the Doukhobor religion, who'd been kind of exiled from Russia because they have some beliefs that sort of quote unquote normal society find a bit difficult. Some of them really dig nudity, some of them don't like their kids to go to school, etc. Anyways, so the Doukhobors in particular, who were often very good farmers, assisted the Japanese. They often traded food, etc. So the part that really makes me angry as an educator is that both the federal and provincial governments refuse to set up schools in the camp. So they've ripped all these kids out of their regular lives, traumatized them by, dragging them into the PNE grounds, housing them in animal barns, throwing them on trains, and then, transporting them to the mountains, to the middle of nowhere. And then they're not going to let them go to school. So the internees in the camps and outside organizations, particularly churches, worked to set up and run schools for the folks, the kids in the schools. In the spring of 1943, largely due to pressure from various churches, the federal government finally agreed to fund schools for the littlest kids, to fund primary schools. So nothing for elementary schools, nothing for the high school kids. So this map shows you both where the prisoner of war camps were in Ontario. So here you have Angler, it's on the north shore of Lake Superior. You have Petawawa, it's at the southern tip of the Hudson Bay, right? And then over here in BC, you can see there's a cutout. So please notice that the camps are as far away from the Pacific Ocean as you can get and still be in British Columbia. They're almost in Alberta. They're right on the border of British Columbia and Alberta in the Rockies. Okay, so in the cutout here, you can see where these towns were. So there's Trail to sort of center you. And then you can see there's internment camps and then a couple of road camps, right? So they're all pretty close together. And I'll show you some photos in a moment so you can get a sense of the environment they were in. So here you have an image of an internment camp. And you can see in this picture, the main reason I want to show you this picture is what's around the internment camp. It's basically forest and mountain. So even if folks were able to escape, quote unquote, there's not really anywhere for them to go. You can also see in this picture these little sort of shack things that people are living in. The one closest to the foreground has some laundry flying. And you can see a little garden also. So folks were growing their own food. They were doing their best to sort of survive in those conditions. Okay, so there's the garden, there's the laundry, there's all these shacks. Okay, you can get a sense of the size of the shacks because you can see these big trees, right? So they weren't very big. Am I stuck here? There we go. So enforced labor. It's important to note that the internment wasn't just about people sitting idle in the prison camps. It was also about extracting cheap, heavy labor from Japanese Canadians. So this was kind of a racist dream come true. The Japanese families, about 3,000 people that were largely from the Fraser Valley, that were shipped to the beet farms, were supposed to provide cheap labor and bust the largely Eastern European Alberta Sugar Beet Workers Union. All right, so let me tell you the story of this. So in Canada, we cannot grow sugar cane. The climate is too cold. What we grow here is sugar beets. Beets grow in the ground. They are a root vegetable, and they're a little bit challenging to grow. They're also really challenging to harvest. So working on a sugar beet farm was incredibly hard work. And in Alberta, there were numerous sugar beet farms, and the sugar beet farmers hired mostly Eastern European immigrants. And we've talked in this class multiple times about why bosses like to hire new immigrants. The Eastern European immigrants who worked on the sugar beet farms were treated terribly. They were housed on the farms. The housing was terrible. This might be reminding you of the seasonal agricultural worker program these days. They worked really long hours. They had very little protection from injury or the equipment. It was really hard work, and they were paid very poorly. So what happened was these Eastern European immigrants organized a union, the Eastern European Alberta Sugar Beet Workers Union. And this was a very strong union, partly because these folks had a really good sense of solidarity and they stuck together. And the sugar beet farmers couldn't beat the union. They had to pay the workers better. They had to treat the workers better. And they were very annoyed about this. So they had written multiple letters to the federal government saying, hey, can you do something about this? Can you, find some way to get rid of this union, to make these awful, dirty immigrants behave, et cetera, et cetera. And so when the Japanese were put in prison camps, some bright light in Ottawa went, hey, I bet we can use this to solve the problem of the Alberta Sugar Beet Workers Union. Because the best way to bust a union, in case you haven't noticed from the stuff we talked about with the wobblies and the blanket stiffs, is that when the union goes out on strike, you replace those workers, right? So the strike is ineffective. The workers in the union have basically lost their jobs, and there goes the union. But nobody wanted to take the jobs of the sugar beet workers because the jobs were so crap. So up until the bosses had Japanese prisoners to do this work, they couldn't do anything about the Alberta Sugar Beet Workers Union. But these Japanese families, these 3,000 people, were sent by the government to the Alberta sugar beet farms to replace these Eastern European unionized workers. Right? So these Japanese families ended up in the same horrible conditions, right? They were in horrible housing. They were doing this incredibly hard work. And because they were prisoners of war, they had no rights to speak of, all right? They were told they weren't allowed to meet with other Japanese in the area because there were some Japanese immigrants in Alberta, and they were basically treated like slave labor. Fortunately, the Japanese kind of ignored the don't talk to other Japanese people rule, and the BC Japanese families organized with some help from the Alberta Japanese community, and they managed to push back against the farmers and win some small concessions, right? At the same time, some of those resistors that I told you about who had been shipped to the Ontario prisoner of war camps were allowed to be released if they were just going to jobs in Ontario and Quebec. So they weren't allowed to go back to BC. They weren't allowed to go to Alberta. They were only allowed to stay in Ontario and Quebec if they had jobs. The Japanese internees in the BC interior, the men and the older boys were being used as work crews for road work and other projects. And my favorite story of the Japanese men being used for road work is the story that I am going to tell you now. In the summer of 1942, so you'll remember this is just after folks have been shipped out to the interior, the federal government, well, the BC government really, organized swing crews of uprooted Japanese men to pick fruit in the Okanagan Valley. When the Japanese Canadian crew arrived on the farms, however, they discovered that the fruit farmers had arbitrarily decided that they were going to pay the Japanese prisoners half of what the white fruit pickers were being paid. The crew leader at the time was a gentleman named John Kumagai, and he was a really smart fellow, and he talked the other Japanese men into walking the 12 miles back to their base camp with him. So basically they went on strike. They said, no way are we working for half what these other people are working for. Kumagai was bright. He had correctly assumed that the local whites would be more alarmed if there were, and this is how the media actually put it, Japs running loose in the valley, the Okanagan Valley, than they would be if non-whites were paid the same wages as whites. So they basically, the Japanese work crews basically went on strike. And in the ensuing uproar, the federal government stepped in and told the farmers that the Japanese workers had to be paid the full rate, the same rate as the white workers. So here we have a picture of Japanese men at road camp. They are eating their dinner here, and they received 25 cents an hour as their pay. And they had to pay boarding fees. So they had to pay for the places that they slept, and they had to pay for their food out of that 25 cents an hour. On January 19th, 1943, the Department of the Custodian of Enemy Alien Property was allowed by the federal government, by an order in council, to take away the properties of the Japanese internees without their consent. Despite the fact that the government had promised to hold these properties in trust, the custodian of enemy property sold the confiscated properties to white BC residents at bargain prices without the owner's consent. The proceeds were used to pay for the administrative costs of the sales and the living expenses of the prisoners, of the internees. So basically, Japanese Canadians paid for their own internment. This was and is contrary to the Geneva Convention, which states that prisoners of war do not have to pay for their own imprisonment. So at the time, 1943, intense racism continued to be the determining factor in Canadian policy. Ian Mackenzie, the Member of Parliament from Vancouver, you'll remember, declared on the 4th of April 1942, "It is my intention, as long as I remain in public life, to see that they, the Japanese, never come back here." Right? So you'll remember Vancouver is on the coast, so all the Japanese had to leave Vancouver. By 1943, plans were already underway in the government to remove all Japanese from British Columbia permanently and to deport as many Japanese Canadians as possible. This is a picture of another one of the internment camps. So this is Lemon Creek, and it's a clearer image, thank goodness. So you can see at Lemon Creek there were some larger housings, some sort of more like barracks, and also at Lemon Creek you get a kind of a clearer picture of the sort of wilderness around. So you can see a road. Let's see if I can get the pointer. You can see a road off here to the side, but basically surrounded in mountains and forest. Okay. In 1944, Prime Minister Mackenzie King and his cabinet decided on a policy of repatriatism. This is a really fancy word for throwing the Japanese out of Canada. It required Japanese Canadians to leave BC, and any who refused would be stripped of their citizenship and deported to Japan. Right? In 1945, the war ended and Japan surrendered, right? So the US dropped two, really it was unnecessary, but 2 nuclear bombs on Japan, and Japan surrendered. Japanese Canadians over 16 were given the option of being deported back to Japan or moving east of the Rockies, so out of British Columbia. And this was supposed to prove their faithfulness, their loyalty to Canada. After years of incredibly poor treatment, almost 43% of the Japanese population of Canada, or 6,884 Japanese Canadians and 3,503 of their children/dependents, signed for repatriation. 86% of those 10,347 potential repatriates resided in British Columbia. A year later, 66% of them changed their minds and applied to remain in Canada. You have to remember, these folks were stuck in prison camps. They weren't getting news. They did not understand, first of all, that Japan had basically been blown to bits and was a terrible mess, right? But also they didn't understand all the conditions, right? So those Japanese who were resettled from BC, so the people who who went east, right? They weren't allowed to buy land, and they needed special licenses to grow crops on any leased land. This resettlement was not voluntary. The only people who were allowed to stay in BC were the sick, the unemployable, the veterans of World War I, their families, and those who lived in some self-supporting communities, right? The others, they were called relocatables, were denied the right to jobs in British Columbia and were forced to leave. In 1945, various legal challenges of these deportations under the War Measures Act failed. The cabinet largely ignored pleas for moderation and ordered the deportation. Remember, the war is over, all right? The deportation of 10,000 Japanese Canadians, many of whom had never seen Japan. Most of them had been born in Canada. The Supreme Court decided that the government could legally deport the 6,844 who had signed repatriation requests, right? But not their dependents. Okay, so across Canada, people were sort of figuring out that the Japanese who were in Canada had nothing to do with the war, all right? And were understanding that having thrown all of them in prison camps for the duration of the war was maybe not okay. So there was an anti-deportation lobby, and it raised money. It distributed pamphlets explaining these things. It organized public meetings to try and drum up public support for the Japanese Canadians. Priests and ministers made sermons in churches and synagogues and gurdwaras. The members of the lobby talked to their neighbors and their friends, and they had meetings with the Prime Minister and their MPs, and they successfully got the attention of the Canadian media, the Canadian press. So this is a picture of the Japanese men being registered at the beginning of the war. In the summer of 1946, the deportations began. 3,965 people boarded the ships to Japan because they felt they had no choice. Some of them were the elderly Issei, the first generation of Japanese immigrants who had lost everything during the war, and they left hoping that their families in Japan would support them in their old age. Those whose relatives had been trapped in Japan by the war had to go to Japan if they wished to be reunited. There wasn't internet, and there was very little phone communication. In December 1946, the prison camps were virtually empty. Only 900 sick and elderly and their families remained at the New Denver camp in the Slocan Valley. Over 13,000 Japanese Canadians had resettled east of British Columbia. They'd left the province. In 1946, the War Measures Act expired because the war was long over. But the government put in place the National Emergency Transitional Powers Act to keep measures against the Japanese Canadians in place. So in 1947, at the beginning of the year, only 6,776 Japanese Canadians remained in British Columbia, less than a third of the population of Japanese Canadians in 1942. Deportation orders for an additional 10,000 Japanese Canadians were finally stopped, in large part due to massive public protests. In 1947, Japanese Americans had been allowed to return to the Pacific coast. Their belongings had not been sold to pay for their imprisonment, and they had been given the vote. In Canada, the Citizenship Act was expanded to include Chinese and Asians, but it still excluded Japanese in 1947. It was only in 1949 that the restrictions imposed, so this is 4 years after the end of the war, that the restrictions imposed under the War Measures Act were finally lifted. The Japanese Canadians were finally free to locate anywhere in Canada, and they were given, finally, the right to vote. So it didn't take that long after the end of World War II for non-Japanese Canadians to regret the inhumane treatment of all of those Japanese Canadians. In 1950, Justice Henry Byrd recommended $1.2 million in compensation to individuals minus their legal fees and rejected any further claims from the Japanese Canadian community. This worked out to about $52 per person. And it completely ignored the violation of civil rights, the sale of all of their property, the loss of earnings, the disruption to education for the young people, and the psychological trauma. Very few Japanese filed for this settlement. Actual property losses during the war for Japanese Canadians were estimated at $50 million. And the total economic loss, if you include lost earnings, disruption to education, etc., was found to be $443 million. This was a National Association of Japanese Canadians hired forensic accountants in 2006 to do this math. The push for redress for Japanese Canadian survivors of the camps started in 1977. It was during the 100-year anniversary, the celebrations of the first Japanese immigrants coming to Canada. that Japanese Canadians sort of looked at each other and said, hey, we got treated really badly. In 1980, a group of Japanese Canadians was sent to Parliament, and this began the first open demands for redress. Their struggle became a national movement, and it led to the formation of the National Coalition for Japanese Canadian Redress, which had representatives from many different unions, churches, ethnic groups, and other multicultural groups. In January 1984, the National Association of Japanese Canadians officially took the initiative to find recognition for all injustices of World War II and develop the redress mandate. Trudeau's Liberal government, and this was Pierre Trudeau, obviously, in 1984 denied the Japanese Canadian claim for redress. Over the course of a few following years, support grew for those Japanese Canadians, and in 1986 a proposal was sent to the federal government. A poll done in the same year showed that 63% of Canadians showed support for redress, and 45% were in favor of individual compensation. On the 22nd of September in 1988, after a decade of negotiations, Prime Minister Brian Mulroney and Art Miki, the president of the National Association of Japanese Canadians, signed the redress agreement, which was approved by Parliament by order in council and announced. The settlement included an acknowledgement of injustice, a payment of a tax-free $21,000 to all living individuals who had been affected by the War Measures Act, including those born after the war, please note, because the measures against the Japanese were not lifted until 1949. The establishment of a fund for community rebuilding, $12 million. I can't say how important this is. The Japanese Canadian community was deeply impacted by the internment. Japanese Canadians are less likely than any other ethnic group in Canada to teach their children their language. Japanese Canadians are more likely than most groups in Canada to marry someone outside their own ethnic group, right? These are assimilation strategies. Being Japanese and preserving Japanese culture just led all the Japanese in BC to be subject to incredible discrimination and imprisonment, right? So the rebuilding of the Japanese community and culture in Canada was actually a very important project. The agreement included the clearing of criminal records of those convicted under the War Measures Act, so those young folks who had been sent to Petawawa and Angler in particular. It included a restitution of citizenship, so the people who had had their citizenship stripped, even some of those who had been sent to Japan, were allowed to get their citizenship back. And it created the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, which was established in 1997 to help fight racism. Audrey Kobayashi writes about that. The Canadian Race Relations Foundation is an excellent organization. I often check to see what research they are doing or have done lately to see if I can use that in my courses. In 1993, it was estimated that 18,000 survivors had received individual compensation. Also, in January of 1984, the NAJC, the National Association of Japanese Canadians, called for a review of the War Measures Act to make sure that no Canadians would ever be subject to such wrongdoings again. Now, this I think is amazing, right? They didn't need to do that. They got all this other stuff in the agreement, but they still said, you know, we want to make sure this doesn't happen to other people. So in July 1988, the War Measures Act was revoked, and it was replaced with the Emergency Act. The Emergency Act forbid prejudiced government orders. It allows Parliament to override emergency orders of the government. It required the questioning of the actions of the government in any emergency, and it provides a compensation to the victims of government actions. Unfortunately, that law was replaced by a much nastier law by Stephen Harper while he was in office. So the last thing that I want to talk about that kind of wraps up talking about the Japanese Canadians, but I want to make sure that we also talk about the St. Louis and about Jewish refugees, because that is the other sort of egregious thing that Canada did during World War II. Right. So on May 13th of 1939, 937 passengers sailed on the German transatlantic liner, the St. Louis, from Hamburg, Germany, heading for Havana, Cuba. All right, so most of the people on the boat were Jews fleeing the anti-Semitic policies of the Nazis. The majority had applied for American visas, and Cuba was just kind of a protectorate of the United States at the time. The Cuban Revolution hadn't happened yet. And they planned to stay in Cuba only until they could enter the United States. 8 days before they sailed, the president of Cuba, who was basically an American puppet, invalidated their landing certificates. When the St. Louis arrived in Havana, only 28 passengers were allowed to get off the boat. 6 of these were not Jewish, and the remaining had somehow managed to get themselves valid entry documents. The remaining 909 passengers were sent on the boat away from Havana. They were then, basically the St. Louis cruised up and down the Atlantic coast of North America and then South America, trying to get into various countries so that the refugees could find new homes. They were rejected by the United States and every Latin American country that they tried. Argentina actually took a really large number of Jewish refugees, but they did not take these ones. They also tried to get into Canada, and Canada refused to help. In Quebec, anti-Semitic newspapers attacked the prospect of Jewish immigration. And Mackenzie King wanted to get reelected, and he needed the Quebec vote. He may have been sympathetic to the plight of European Jewry, but he was held back by widespread opposition. Immigration policy remained stringent. So Frederick C. Blair, who is the director of the immigration branch of the Department of Mines and Resources, declared, "No country could open its doors wide enough to take in the hundreds of thousands of Jewish people who want to leave Europe. The line must be drawn somewhere." In 1930, the Canadian government had stopped all immigration from Europe, with the exception of those with enough money to support themselves on farms and those with immediate family already in the country. In 1931, the government set new restrictions that only British and American citizens who were in farming, mining, logging, and lumbering would be considered for residency. So not only did Canada turn away the St. Louis, and the St. Louis ended up going back to Germany, and many of the people who were on that boat ended up dying in concentration camps. Between the years of 1933 and 1939, out of approximately 800,000 Jews who were trying to get away from the Nazis, Canada admitted 4,000 people. So we don't have a lot to be proud of around our record around humanitarian care, immigration, and refugees in Canada during World War II. So history is not just about the past, it's also about the present. So right now in Canada, we have a situation where a lot of people are afraid again. Right, in 2001, those of you who are alive will remember there was a situation where a lot of people were afraid. All right, so what mistakes do you think the Canadian government made during World War II? Just jot down 3 things that you think were mistakes that the government made. And what lessons can we take from those mistakes? Right, so the Japanese-Canadian Redress Committee wanted us to see that it was important that we think about how our laws work, right? If we have we need laws that are for special and difficult situations, right? But we need to make sure that those laws don't discriminate against people, and especially not against entire communities of people. And are any of these mistakes being repeated today? What do you think? Are we repeating any of these mistakes? What's going on with immigration now? So thank you for your time, and that's the end of this presentation.